This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. Actually, welcome back from the long 4th of July weekend. I hope you had a great Independence Day. You know, it was poignant in the sense that, we had, the celebrations. There were fireworks everywhere. Actually, quite a few fireworks, and sounded like people were having a good time. And, my son made a comment to me that, well, I'm still ruminating on it a few days later. And he just said, Dad, sometimes it just feels like we're just going through the motions when it comes to celebrating Independence Day. And so we talked for a little bit about what exactly does that mean, just going through the motions. And I think he has a point. What he was describing is we're going through all the, look at us celebrate. Look how free we are. Look how great things are. And yet, I'm not trying to throw a wet blanket on everybody. I'm just going to say, it seems like we're celebrating something that largely does not exist any longer. I'm sorry, I know that sounds kind of negative. Well, wait a minute. What are you doing? Taking away our rainbow here. This is America. And granted, it is. And I believe the efforts of the founding generation, I believe especially the Declaration of Independence, is very worthy of celebration and study and acknowledgement. But I ask this sincerely. How many people who were celebrating, how many people shooting off firecrackers and barbecuing and waving a flag at the parade and whatnot really were contemplating what they were celebrating? Okay, I'll be a little more blunt. They were celebrating things like moral clarity. When is it right to stand up to a tyrant and to say, we withdraw our consent and we will henceforth govern ourselves? Because that's what they were doing. When is it right to secede from the legitimate government under which you live? Because that's exactly what they did. And here it gets a little trickier. When is it right to take up arms in defense of your God-given rights? Because that's what the Declaration of Independence was explaining. It was laying out the reasons for a candid world, let the facts be submitted to a candid world, why we are doing what we're doing. That was their legal as well as their moral justification. And I only point this out to say, where do you see any of these values being celebrated today? I'll give you an example. Okay, the last time someone stood up to federal aggression was the war between the states. And I mean, on a large scale. Now, that doesn't mean the South was 100% right in the sense that to the extent that, they still wanted or needed slavery to continue keeping their economy going. Yeah, that was wrong. But I also would ask you to consider that not a single slave actually every branch of the federal government upheld slavery to the end of the Civil War. So don't pretend that the North was, had their hands clean in this matter. But look at the zeal with which people are going around trying to destroy any reference whatsoever, not only to Confederate symbols. Well, you can't have that Confederate flag. You can't have a Confederate name. You can't have a statue of this Confederate general or whatever. That's all being erased methodically and deliberately. But it's not stopping there. Because apparently there are people who are worried, well, what if we make the connection that actually our 4th of July, which everybody celebrates, that's based in secession from Great Britain. That's based in armed revolution against the legitimate authority. That's based on standing up to tyranny because of moral clarity. What then? Well, we need to vilify and we need to get rid of many of those symbols as well. That's why you'll see the Gadsden flag is under attack. Oh, no, it's not my imagination. The FBI actually considers that. Somebody has a Gadsden flag, yeah, they might be a threat. They might be a domestic terrorist or something. And now it even extends to such things as the flag, an appeal to heaven. You remember this one, the pine tree with the words, an appeal to heaven? I think that scares some of the control freaks even worse than the Gadsden flag. It's one thing to say, don't tread on me, but it's another thing to say, I'm appealing to God because I believe there is a higher authority than man-made authority. Whoa, you can't say that. Because if man-made authority is wrong, which it turns out is often the case, people who appeal to God or people who follow their conscience aren't likely to obey horrific orders. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm starting on a bit of a sour note here, but what I'm asking you to consider is, as you celebrated, as you had a good time with family and friends and in your community, did you stop to think about what you were actually celebrating? The guys who signed their names to the Declaration of Independence, 56 of them, not one of them received some great reward from, the government that they were fighting or the government that they founded. They did not, in any measurable way, profit from what they did. In fact, for many of them, they sacrificed just about everything they had. There was tremendous risk. In fact, can we be blunt here? My friend Connor Boyack has the T-shirt, "Treason is the reason for the season." They were committing treason against their government, at least in the eyes of their government. And every one of them, by signing that document, were effectively signing their own death warrant. If they were caught, they would be tried for treason and hanged. That's pretty serious stuff. Where are the people today who have that kind of conviction, that kind of moral clarity? Because really, in the end, that's what it was. There was an absolute of right and wrong that drove their thinking. Not some lust for power or just, a desire to go out there and get bloody. I'm thinking of this because I was just watching, a news clip out of France yesterday, and it looked like France's government was really, the conservatives had stepped up and said, okay, no more. We're done with this nonsense, whatever Macron had been forcing on them. And so they had the election here, I guess, back in June in the European Union, but they had some kind of a snap election because they dissolved parliament, they dissolved the government. And this time it sounds like a more centrist group, by which I mean the socialists, which is considered centrist in Europe, prevailed. And Antifa, that was all set to riot when the right wing, won in this election, well, it wasn't even the right wing that won, but Antifa still went out and rioted and clashed with police. Yeah, there's some very, very serious instability out there. And I think some of it is being stoked deliberately, both abroad as well as here at home. So I'm asking you, what do you do to make sure that you have moral clarity in matters like this? And I'm saying this with the understanding. I'm not asking you to become, absolutely consumed with politics in every aspect of your life. Lord knows there's enough of that going on. There are people who I think are literally politically possessed. It's all they think about. It's all they obsess over. Everything they do on social media is just politics, politics, politics. They live and breathe it. It's a kind of religion. But if you are faced with decisions and you are faced with growing chaos, how do you make sure that you are charting a true course, consistent with right and wrong? I know that's a little bit tougher question, and maybe you're going to be a little frustrated with, Brian, why are you asking these kind of things? Why are you bringing this up right now? And why are you asking us to think about stuff like this? Because I believe this is what really matters. I believe it's less a matter of, well, who are you going to vote for, and more a matter of what kind of a person are you, both before and after the voting reassurance ritual. I don't really see a lot of great choices. Yes, I will agree Donald Trump is eminently better than his blob alternatives like Joe Biden or whomever they will run in Biden's place when he finally is forced to step down. But as we were saying back in 2016, is this the best we can do? Is this the best that politics has to offer because it just seems to get worse with every successive election. So I'm going to ask you to keep that in mind over the next few weeks and months. I just have a hunch. I'm not hankering for this. It's a hunch that things are going to become even more chaotic, much like what we're seeing right now in France. Power is at stake. Confidence and trust in the people who are in power right now is quickly eroding. How do you make sure that you are charting the kind of course that keeps you within the bounds of moral truth? Actually, I have a great essay from Paul Rosenberg. I'm going to share that with you coming up right after the break. Please stay with me.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. All right, I'm sorry to come charging out of the gates, Mr. Negative Ned here. But this has kind of been weighing on my mind this weekend. I see what's happening to my beloved country. I see what's happening to the principles and practices of freedom, which are kind of an afterthought. Some people may shed a tear, at the thought of, oh, yes, there's a principle at stake here. But for the most part, I think people just kind of pass it by and go the route of least resistance. Most people, I think, if you were to ask them, hey, what exactly is an unalienable right, would be very hard-pressed to describe it. They might be able to tell you, well, I think it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that's great. But what makes those rights unalienable? What does it mean for them to be unalienable? And of course, by that we mean they are untouchable. They are the kind of rights, they are natural rights, and their purpose is to limit government power over us. You don't see a lot of people with that kind of understanding or with the willingness, if they have that understanding, to say it out loud. Why? Because it sounds foreign. It sounds like some radical idea. Probably outdated, which is more or less how we've been trained to see that over many generations. So let's talk for a moment about absolutes. I've heard it said, in fact, I think it's been close to 30 years since I interviewed the author of a book, The New Absolutes. Or maybe it's just The New Absolute. I believe that was the name of the book. I probably still have it around here somewhere if I were to look on my bookshelf close enough. But the idea is that the new absolute is there are no absolutes, right? There's my truth, there's your truth. He has his truth, she has her truth, them has their truth, whatever the case may be. But there is no absolute. Are you sure of that? Absolutely. Okay. So there's no right, there's no wrong. Paul Rosenberg begs to differ. He says, no, actually, if there's life and death, there are objective standards, meaning there is right and wrong. Here's how he puts it. He says, the existence of absolute standards threatens a great deal of modern power, and so has long been ridiculed and excluded from consideration. But he says, reality, however, cannot be changed. And the fact is that we all act for life and against death. And so does every other living thing on this planet, which means that makes life and death absolute and objective standards. Actions trump words, they trump ridicule, and they very definitely trump academic theories. The absolute standard of life as good is upheld in actual practice by every person who takes medicine or by anyone who avoids danger. You see his point? Oceans of rhetoric can't negate this. We and every other creature on the planet act to stay alive and to flee death. Those with a need to wipe away the possibility of an absolute standard betray themselves every time they take an antibiotic or buy organic produce. And so this also stands. That which sustains and extends life is good or right. That which hinders or ends life is bad or wrong. I know, that one is going to cause a few people to go, hey, wait a minute. But I think he's correct. Paul asks, why all the opposition? He says, our need to extend and improve life has driven more or less every medical, technological, and agricultural improvement of human history. So why then would anyone want to exclude it? And the first answer is that they simply don't see it. They've come to see a constructed reality as the whole playing field of life, and they're struggling to find status within it. But he says the second answer is the more important one, and that is life, if held to and pursued, will negate the power structures of this world, and fairly quickly. Here's what he means. Life spawns chosen, decentralized, and organic organization. The people and organizations that oppose that model require us to be constrained. They require automatic compliance, and they couldn't survive any other way. The lords of the constructed reality then cannot allow life to break out of its constraints. They fear the recognition of an objective standard because it would wipe away their intellectual sandcastles and make auto-compliance nearly impossible. He says life-spawned organization is everywhere, of course. It's the way healthy families organize themselves. It's how small businesses organize themselves. It's the way little leagues and book clubs and tutoring clubs and 100 similar groups organize themselves. This is the model of chosen grouping, and it injects life, decency, and progress into the world. Now, the lords of constructed reality require enforced grouping. They forbid, by any number of means, alternatives to themselves. That fact should condemn them right off, except that most people have been confused and conditioned otherwise. They've been taught by the constructed reality that the construct is the only reality, and the advocates for anything else are maniacs. This is why homeschoolers used to get so much grief when they would say, I want to homeschool my kids. Why would you want to do that? Aren't they going to grow up some kind of social retard or something? Yeah, we actually used that word back then. Look at what's being pushed in the public schools today. What do you suppose that's doing to manipulable young minds? Yeah. So Paul says the constructed reality then must destroy opponents beginning with God because he would be the ultimate objective standard. And it must also trivialize life, which also threatens to undo them. And so, if life is a good value, he says we should act to extend it and enhance it. And we do that by using life-friendly tools like chosen grouping, voluntary trade, honest money, unhindered innovation, and virtues that accompany these things. By the way, the chosen grouping, there's another way of saying that may be more familiar to you, and that is voluntary association. You choose for yourself, who do I wish to hang out with? It's that simple. And I know that there are whole systems right now that are constructed, but you must accept this too, and that, and them, and they. Okay. But you don't have to. As long as your behavior is peaceful, you should be able to voluntarily associate with whomever you wish to, which means you also can choose not to associate with certain people or practices that do not meet your standards. That doesn't mean you're operating from a position of supremacy. It just means you're able to make your own decisions. And frankly, if you want to keep the peace, that's how you keep the peace. You let people choose with whom they are most comfortable. Somehow we've been taught that, that's terrible. Why, everybody needs to be colorblind. And nope. Everybody just needs to be able to freely associate. Because that's when differences like skin color or whatever gender group you fit into don't really matter. Paul says we use the tools of life-friendly actions like chosen grouping, voluntary trade, honest money, unhindered innovation. We do that by stepping away from the constructed reality, the virtual world of manufactured images, narratives, and fears. Now, he says fear, as he's noted often enough, but probably not often enough, is a brain hack. It's kryptonite to the human mind. Fear chains people within the construct where they're informed endlessly. You have to believe what you're told because everybody else does. You don't want to be different. So he says life in the construct then becomes all virtual, all vicarious, and all externally derived. It's the antithesis of the model of Jesus, Carl Jung, and others, every other independent thinker throughout human history. The alternative to the construct is to build a chosen society centered on the golden rule. And he says this model is known to work for us, being again the model of the healthy family, the productive small business, and so on. Our way, he says, is the better way. The way that takes life as an absolute standard, and it is. By the way, if you want to get a glimpse of that artificial construct that's trying to keep everybody within the same mental corral, just look for those sources that are using fear to sell whatever it is that they're peddling. Particularly watch the politicians who have nothing but fear to try to keep people within that mental pen.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. By the way, you can find the links to all the articles that I'm sharing in today's program on today's show notes page. Those would be the show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. Show notes for July 8th, 2024. Good heavens, we are a fourth of the way through the month, and it seems like we just barely started. Oh well, here we go. So, you've probably noticed the chaos is not abating. I don't know what's going on with Joe Biden right now. Last week was a meltdown of epic proportions. There's a lot of infighting going on within the Democratic Party. And while on the one hand, I kind of want to savor it just because they have been so obnoxious and so just abusive to roughly half the country that isn't them. It's kind of good to see them get theirs, but it also makes them rather dangerous because they're desperate. They know that they are backing a loser at this point. And it just makes you wonder, what are they going to do? When there are people who believe that by any means necessary, we've got to stay in power. Well, that brings me to an article by J.B. Shurk from American Thinker, who also notes that the chaos is not abating. So what do we do about it? He suggests freedom gardens, speech corridors, and black markets. This kind of goes along with the whole voluntary association and those decentralized things that Paul Rosenberg was talking about. A chosen society. Here's how J.B. Shurk puts it. First, he says, battered conservative syndrome is real. We have gotten clobbered over the head so many times during the last decade that we're almost numb to the pain. Even worse, we've been conditioned to accept each new blow as if we somehow deserved it more than the last. But he says we do not. We've seen how quickly Western governments will use every emergency, that's in quotation marks, to dispatch civil liberties. We've watched American political operatives rig elections with mail-in ballot fraud. We've endured online censorship of our political speech. We have been targets of gun-grabbing politicians seeking to disarm us. We've suffered discrimination from banks that refuse us service. We've remained mostly quiet as the DOJ treats J6 protesters as seditious traitors and blacklists the rest of us as likely terrorists. We put up with Marxist prosecutors, maliciously pursuing us for our personal beliefs. We've kept our heads down while corporate employers demand total obedience to their woke religion. And we also know what's coming. The technological infrastructure for vaccine passports, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, online speech codes, race-based privileges, AI surveillance, and social credit scores is being built right now. Climate change fanatics are making it harder and more expensive to grow food. Digital prison walls are going up all around us. Green energy regulators and technocratic snoops are creating a system that minimizes our freedom and maximizes their control. So the question then is whether we use this foresight to prepare for the future or to complain about its inevitability. He says, I ran across someone online warning that the green energy Nazis were driving up the cost of energy so quickly that we would all freeze to death during the next few winters. Perhaps, cold people will revert to collecting wood for indoor fires. He says, I figure that we will know when the Green New Deal totalitarian is winning when we see formerly law-abiding citizens illegally logging in their protected forests and parks. The more expensive energy becomes, the more likely that the skies above towns and cities will be filled with soot. You see, necessity is a wonderful motivator. People who are forced to choose between survival and subservience weigh their options more adroitly. And he says, that's why I'm ultimately optimistic about our future, even though I know bad times are surely coming. Some generations must witness the evil of totalitarianism before they finally recognize that unconstrained government power is as deadly as any disease. After all, what caused greater social harm? The COVID virus or the government's abusive lockdowns, economic destruction, and authoritarian mandates? Now ask yourself how you can best prepare for the next time the police state demands total compliance. See, a century ago, homeowners all over the country cultivated essential crops, no matter how small their parcel of land. During both world wars, the federal government actively encouraged citizens to grow what they could so as to increase the available food supply for our fighting forces overseas. Fast forward to the present, and government agencies are actively discouraging homeowners from growing their own food. Municipal ordinances and neighborhood covenants prevent citizens from maximizing the benefits of land ownership. Environmental regulations turn home gardens into potential legal liabilities. The federal government harasses Amish farmers and other experts in husbandry for ignoring bureaucratic rules written by cubicle kings who don't even know how to farm. J.B. Shurk says, does it seem a little strange that the government know-it-alls work so hard to prevent Americans from growing their own food when people around the world suffer from hunger? Wouldn't any government that pats itself on the back for being progressive and humanitarian find great benefit in increasing America's production and supply of basic crops? A cynical person might conclude that the U.S. government does not want Americans to be self-sufficient because a self-sufficient population is much harder to manipulate. An even more cynical person might suggest that the World Economic Forum and its fascist friends can never force Americans to eat the bugs unless Americans are starving first. After all, how can the World Economic Forum's Malthusian enthusiasts reduce the planet's human population unless those who wish to control us also control what we have to eat? So what's the obvious answer to this increased fragility in the food supply? Well, J.B. Shurk says Americans must reacquire rudimentary farming skills. They must experiment with potatoes, corn, legumes, and other nutritious crops and understand what's required to produce even small amounts of food. They must rediscover the benefits of gardening. The more they learn now, the more likely they will survive hardship. If they choose not to prepare today, they will be left to the mercy of those who control what's left to eat, such as bug enthusiast and synthetic food investor Bill Gates, should they ever find themselves starving. During times of crisis, he says, growing food is like growing currency. Whatever a person has to eat becomes a medium of exchange. Battered conservatives who can see the erection of totalitarian CBDCs in our future often assume that little can be done to avert their imposition. Once runaway inflation hits a point where debts cannot be repaid and people cannot afford basic necessities, central banks will have government funny money. And they'll have the perfect financial emergency to justify a transition toward digital government funny money. With such a system in place, government agents will control not only what you can buy with those digital dollars, but also the purchasing power of what's been allotted to your account. It's the ideal vehicle for creating a society where nobody owns anything aside from the central bankers, and everyone receives the same income regardless of skill, merit, or hard work. Central bank digital currencies give Marxist globalists what they want, which is a communist oligarchy in which a small number of technocratic elites totally control the lives of entirely dependent serfs. So what's the obvious answer to this increased fragility in the financial system? It's to put yourself in a position in which you own valuable commodities beyond the reach of CBDC's totalitarian control mechanisms. Now, that doesn't mean you need a private vault of gold, silver, or copper. It means you need to develop the skills that will allow you to grow food for future exchange. In a dystopian world where central bankers supervise all transactions, any market that arises beyond their control represents a small island for freedom. Even in our relatively stable financial system today, illicit black markets account for anywhere from 10 to 30% of the most developed industrial economies. How do you think the imposition of CBDCs will affect those numbers? J.B. Shurk says, my guess is the black market transitions will quickly grow to rival those of the official CBDC-controlled economy. Why? Because under such a communist system, black markets will become the last refuge for free markets. The time to prepare for such potential future difficulties is now. Some might argue that in a world where authorities censor speech and monitor all communications, working outside the government's reach would be impossible. But he says, I would counter that an entire generation of dissidents residing in the Soviet Union and under the Iron Curtain managed to communicate with each other and spread important ideas with nothing more than pens and sheets of paper. However effective AI proves at spying on what we say, people who value freedom will inevitably develop workarounds. And wherever state-sponsored censorship becomes the norm, free speech corridors thrive underground. All of which is to simply say, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. He says, just because many of us have become accustomed to being hit over the head with big brothers or big government's truncheon doesn't mean we should pencil in future beatings. We cannot trust our government to protect our liberties because our liberties are a threat to its power. Now, that's something to remember. But we can remember how to band together and take care of ourselves. Forewarned is forearmed. That's a marvelous piece. Yes, it does contain a little bit of bad news. But he's facing the truth squarely, and I think he has some very solid advice there. Freedom gardens, speech corridors, black markets. I'm in.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. It's our final segment today. Back in the swing of things for the second week of July. So I don't know if it struck you like it struck me, but it was really curious to watch the media go through the mental gymnastics of its professed shock. We still can't believe that somehow the White House hid Biden's age, how can I put this, deficiencies, his cognitive decline. That was hidden from us. Shocked, I say. I am shocked. And it just rings so hollow. There is no possible way that the press, which has been, mindlessly and blindly supporting Biden from day one, was in the dark on this. But, they're feigning this shock. Well, we were fooled just like you. And in fact, I think they tried the same thing with a lot of the COVID stuff, that it turns out, we kooks who were warning against vaccine mandates and the mask mandates and the shutdowns and everything, that, we turned out to be right. But, why didn't you guys say something? It's not working. I think this is the last desperate gasp of a media that's trying to retain some kind of, if not legitimacy, at least relevance. And I don't think they understand or even have begun to comprehend the depth of contempt that thinking people have toward them. Yeah, there's a few mindless sheep out there still. Tell me what to think. But those numbers are fewer and fewer all the time. And rightly so. By the way, Jonathan Turley, I thought, had a really great essay on the art of being eternally shocked. Wanted to share this one with you. He says, no one would think of the Beltway as being a place of naive innocence of our society. Washington is the only ecosystem composed of entirely of apex predators. That's well put. Yet this week, everyone seems to be eternally shocked by what's been obvious for years. He says the press and pundits are coming off an embarrassing couple of weeks where the Hunter Biden laptop was authenticated in federal court as real. This occurred in the trial of the president's son, almost on the anniversary of a debunked letter of intelligence officials claiming that the laptop appeared to be Russian disinformation. Biden then repeated the claim in the last presidential debates to avoid answering questions over the massive influence peddling scheme of this family revealed by the laptop. Well, after the story was suppressed before the 2020 election, it took years for the media to admit that, oops, the laptop is surprisingly real. He says for years, the press and pundits piled on experts who suggested that COVID-19 escaped from a Chinese lab. The New York Times reporter covering the area called it racist and implausible. But now even the World Health Organization accepts the lab theory as possible and federal agencies now believe it is the most likely explanation. The response? Surprise and spin. Well, this last week, the Supreme Court ruled the Justice Department has unlawfully charged hundreds of people with obstruction of an official proceeding after the January 6th riot. And for years, objections to the excessive treatment of these cases were dismissed as the view of the radical right. But now even Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson voted to toss out these convictions. Surprise! Jonathan Turley says whether it was the false story about agents whipping migrants in Texas or the photo op claim in Lafayette Park, false stories were disproven only to have a collective shrug from those who spread them. For years, the press and pundits have repeated the godlike gospel that Trump had called neo-Nazis fine people. At the time, most of us noted that Trump condemned both the racists and neo-Nazis and made the statement about fine people on both sides of the controversy over the removal of historic statues. 6 years later, Snopes finally decided to do a fact check and found, surprise, that Trump never praised neo-Nazis as fine people. The only person not surprised was Biden, who repeated the false story on Friday as true. Heading into the presidential debate, the White House and media attacked Fox News and other outlets for cheap fake videos designed to make the president look confused and feeble. For months, politicians and pundits have insisted that Biden is sharp and commanding in conversations, even after special counsel Robert Hur cited his decline as a reason for not charging him criminally for the unlawful retention and mishandling of classified material. On MSNBC, Joe Scarborough stated, "Start your tape right now, because I'm about to tell you the truth, and F you if you can't handle the truth." This version of Biden, intellectually, analytically, is the best Biden ever. Not a close second, and I've known him for years. If it weren't the truth, I wouldn't say it. Well, he's going to be eating those words with both hands. Then the presidential debate happened, and after years of being protected by staff, tens of millions of people watched the president struggle to stay focused and responsive. After the debate, there was total surprise, if not shock, on CNN and MSNBC. Suddenly, it's not a cheap fake, but reality. Turley says just 7 days before the debate, the New York Times was running cheap fake articles on how Biden was being wrongly portrayed. The day after the debate, it was calling for him to withdraw from the race after expressing shock at his appearance. On CNN, biographer and CNN contributor Evan Osnos admitted that many Americans were likely shocked by Biden's appearance. I don't think there's any other way to put it. This was clearly a person who was diminished from where he was on the debate stage 4 years ago. Pro-Biden columnist Thomas Friedman wrote that he was floored by what he saw, and the heartbreaking appearance of Biden made him weep. So Washington is now full of surprises. It's a city of people who display that practiced faux shock that you adopt when you learn in advance that your friends are throwing you a surprise party. The key is to look stunned and then mingle. It is a city of Claude Rains, and by the way, he includes the clip from Casablanca. I am shocked to find gambling going on here. So Jonathan Turley says the laptop is real, the president is really old, and Washington is really, really phony. The only thing that would be more surprising is if pundits in the press started being a lot less shocked and more honest. A good point. But then again, I've been beating this drum for a while. You cannot trust what is being fed to you by the media, even your preferred conservative media. If you want to be informed, you've got to be able to think clearly and independently. That means you've got to be willing to do more of your own fact-checking. You've got to learn to think like an expert. It's not that hard. But you need to do it. All right, one final article. This is from Caitlin Johnstone. Actually, 2 articles. I'll get back to Caitlin Johnstone in just a moment. You've seen slogans like, eradicate the hate on T-shirts and stuff. There's a lot of this stuff going around last month during Pride Month. When you hear people talking about, we're going to eradicate hate, we cannot have hate in our communities. North Idaho, I'm looking at you, since you guys seem to be really on the bandwagon. They want to eradicate hate so bad, they'll actually manufacture events to try to justify how they're eradicating it. But when it comes to eradication fantasies, you need to understand, they do not come free. Thomas Harrington has a great explanation. This is from the Brownstone Institute's website. And he flat out says, look, he says, if I saw someone wearing a shirt that says, eradicate or eliminate the hate. He says, I'd like to talk to him and just ask him and say, hey, I think you probably have a nice, lofty ideal here, but let me ask you something. Do you honestly believe that there is nothing that could cause you to hate? Because those of us who are human will often run into things that we, from time to time, hate. And he says, I bet within a few statements I could get you to start displaying hateful behavior. Maybe I just put on a MAGA hat and, it's going to come right out in the open. And he's got a point. That's not encouraging people to be hateful, but it's recognizing that any attempt to eradicate something that is a part of human nature is doomed to totalitarian type solutions. It's about thought control. It's not about, that noble effort of we're going to purge hate from our society. You want to purge hate from a society? Show by example the power of what it means to really love your fellow man, to live the golden rule. And when people voluntarily choose to live the golden rule, hate will find no place. I know it seems simplistic, but I've seen it work time and again. But it has to be voluntary or it's not real. All right. One final thought here. This is Caitlin Johnstone. You're hearing a lot of talk about democracy. We're trying to save our democracy. And, of course, by democracy, what the person saying it means is our regime. Caitlin Johnstone says saying democracy is in jeopardy in America is like saying the beaches are in jeopardy in Wyoming. She is a gem. She says, your country is run by a few billionaires and government agencies. You don't get a real vote. And even if you did, you're all propagandized anyway. It's not a real thing. I know that's blunt. Probably feels like a smack across the face. Maybe we need that from time to time just to, remind us that, okay, I may have been laboring under an illusion of some sort. Nonetheless, I have a link to Caitlin Johnstone's article in today's show notes. Check them out for yourself at the BryanHydeShow.com. These are the show notes for July 8th, 2024. While you're there, consider subscribing. I'll drop you an email every morning that I do the show. You can follow the stories on your own and become a better informed, more clear and independent thinker because the truth matters.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.